The 2013 California prisoner hunger strike. In the summer of 2013, the state of California witnessed one of the largest prison protests in American history. It did not begin with riots or burning buildings. It began with silence and with thousands of uneaten meals. Behind the thick concrete walls of Pelican Bay State Prison, one of California's most notorious maximum security facilities, a group of men made a decision that would shake the prison system to its core. They refused to eat. At the heart of the movement were men held inside what was known as the Security Housing Unit, or simply the SHU. It was a place few people outside the prison system had ever seen, but everyone inside feared. These were windowless cells, barely the size of a parking space. The men who lived there spent 22 to 24 hours a day locked inside. There was no sunlight, no touch, and almost no sound except the constant hum of fluorescent lights. They were allowed out for an hour to pace inside a small concrete cage they called the dog run. Some have been living this way for 10, 20, even 30 years. Many of them were not in solitary for committing new crimes inside prison. They were there because the California Department of Corrections believed they were affiliated with prison gangs. In many cases, the evidence was little more than a tattoo, a drawing, or the word of another inmate looking for leniency. Once labeled a gang associate, an inmate could be sent to the SHU indefinitely, with no clear path back to the general population. Some prisoners said it felt like being buried alive. A small group of men decided they could not take it anymore. Among them were Todd Ashker, Danny Troxell, and Arturo Castellanos, who had all spent decades in the Pelican Bay SHU. From inside their isolation cells, separated by thick walls, they began communicating in secret through letters, legal papers, and whispers passed by sympathetic guards. They came from different racial groups and even rival gangs, but they were united by one goal: to end indefinite solitary confinement. They called themselves the Corridor Collective. Their protest started quietly in 2011 when several thousand inmates across California joined their first hunger strike. The state made small promises to review its policies, but little changed. So in 2013, they decided to try again, this time on a much larger scale. On July 8, 2013, prisoners in Pelican Bay once again refused their food trays. Within days, the strike had spread across 33 prisons. More than 30,000 inmates took part, making it one of the largest coordinated acts of civil disobedience ever to occur inside an American prison system. The hunger strike was not about privileges or minor complaints. It was about survival and dignity. The men demanded an end to the practice of long-term isolation, which they called psychological torture. They wanted to stop group punishment where entire cell blocks were disciplined for one man's actions. They wanted an end to debriefing, a policy that pressured inmates to inform on others to earn release from the SHU. They wanted proper food, fair treatment, and access to education and rehabilitation programs. To them, it was not rebellion. It was a cry for recognition as human beings. Inside the prisons, guards and officials tried to contain the protest. At first, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation downplayed it, calling it a coordinated gang operation meant to undermine order. But as the days passed and the number of participants remained high, the state could not ignore it. Medical staff began checking inmates daily. Men were collapsing in their cells from weakness and dehydration. Some were taken to hospital wards. Inmates who refused to eat for more than 2 weeks lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds. Outside the prison walls, word of the strike began to spread. Families of the prisoners held rallies on the steps of the state capitol in Sacramento. Civil rights groups like the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights began issuing public statements condemning California's use of solitary confinement. Journalists started to investigate what was really happening inside Pelican Bay. For many members of the public, it was the first time they had heard about the existence of these underground isolation units, where more than 10,000 inmates were locked away with almost no contact with the outside world. As pressure mounted, lawmakers began to take notice. Assemblyman Tom Amiano and Senator Lonnie Hancock called for hearings on the issue. They visited Pelican Bay and spoke with officials and families. For the first time, the voices of the men inside began to reach the outside world. They wrote letters describing their lives, waking up without knowing if it was day or night, pacing in circles to keep their sanity, talking to themselves just to hear another human voice. When your mind starts to play tricks on you, one inmate wrote, you realize what it means to disappear without dying. The hunger strike lasted week after week. The number of active participants began to shrink as some gave in to medical weakness, but hundreds kept going. Then, on July 22nd, tragedy struck. At Corcoran State Prison, a 32-year-old inmate named Billy Guero was found dead in his cell. Authorities said it was suicide, but other inmates insisted he had starved to death. His death became a symbol of the risk the protesters were taking. Even in their weakened state, they refused to give up. The prison system authorized force feeding for inmates who became critically ill, sparking debate over human rights and consent. Lawyers argued that the state was violating their dignity, while officials claimed they were saving lives. By August, the protest had entered its second month. Hundreds of men were still refusing food. The prison administration started transferring strike leaders to other facilities in an attempt to break their coordination. Family visits were restricted, mail was delayed, and disciplinary reports were filed against participants. Yet the strike continued. It was clear that this was no longer just a prison issue. It had become a moral question for the state itself. Finally, in early September, lawmakers met with prison officials and announced that California would review its policies on solitary confinement. On September 5th, after 59 days without eating, the leaders of the strike released a statement announcing they would suspend the protest. In their message, they said, "Our collective efforts have brought solitary confinement to the center of public debate. This struggle is not over, but we have made history." The hunger strike of 2013 did not immediately end solitary confinement in California, but it forced the system to change. The state agreed to reevaluate its gang validation process and to limit the use of long-term isolation. In 2015, a group of inmates led by Todd Ashker filed a class action lawsuit known as Ashker versus Governor California. The case challenged the constitutionality of indefinite solitary confinement. In 2015, the state reached a landmark settlement. It agreed to stop placing prisoners in isolation solely based on gang affiliation and to move thousands of men out of the SHU into other housing units. It also introduced new step-down programs to help prisoners transition back to the general population. By 2016, hundreds of men who had lived for decades in windowless cells were seeing open skies again for the first time. Human rights groups called the settlement a major victory, though they warned that similar practices continued under new names, like restricted housing or administrative segregation. Still, the hunger strike had changed the conversation. It had forced California and the nation to confront a simple truth, that solitary confinement was not just a form of discipline, but a form of psychological torture. The legacy of the 2013 hunger strike extends far beyond Pelican Bay. It demonstrated that even within the most controlled and dehumanizing environment, people could organize, communicate, and fight for change. The men in the short corridor had defied the system that tried to silence them. They had united across racial and gang lines, something few thought possible in the violent and divided world of prison life. In their silence, they spoke louder than any riot ever could. Years later, many of those men still struggle with the effects of isolation. Some describe panic when walking into open spaces. Others say they cannot sleep without a light on, their minds conditioned to confinement. Yet they also describe a sense of pride. They believe they achieved something that had never been done before. They exposed the hidden world of solitary confinement to the public eye. Todd Ashker, one of the original leaders, remains incarcerated but continues to write about prison reform. In a letter to supporters, he said, "They try to bury us in these concrete boxes. They didn't realize we were planting seeds. Those seeds have grown into a broader movement for prison reform, with activists, lawyers, and former inmates working to end the practice of indefinite isolation nationwide." The 2013 California prisoner hunger strike was not about rebellion. It was about humanity. It was about men who had been erased from society, refusing to disappear quietly. For 59 days, they risked their lives not for comfort, but for dignity. They turned their suffering into resistance, their silence into a message that reached far beyond prison walls. And in doing so, they reminded the world that even in the darkest corners of the justice system, the human spirit can still find a way to speak.